Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to The Open Door, a show based on the words in Revelation, "I have left an open door before you, which no one can close." This is WCAT Radio's longest-running show, which opened the door to the radio station in October 2016. It's currently offered by Jim Hanink, Mario Ramos Reyes and friends, and remains open to the love of God in its call to build a culture of life and a just social order through the panel's discussion of the Catholic social teaching principles of solidarity, subsidiarity, and economic democracy. The Open Door also explores nonviolence, distributism, and communitarianism. So join us at the Open Door, where you too can be part of the conversation.
Good morning. Welcome to the Open Door. This morning our special guest is Dr. Peter Mango, and you have entertaining his honor, entertaining Dr. Mango. You have your usual perky, pesky, persevering panelists, to wit, Jim Hanink and Mario Ramos Reyes and Christopher Zender. We're going to be talking about the family under the rubric of Familism, which I personally think is an infelicitous term, but it's developed as a term to refer to the family and the context that the family finds itself in today. We begin, as always, in prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful, and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you will renew the face of the earth. Lord, by the light of the Holy Spirit, you have taught the hearts of your faithful. In the same Spirit, help us to relish what is right, and always rejoice in your consolation. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Peter Mango has a doctorate in philosophy from an impressively named institution, the Pontifical Athenaeum, Regina, Apostolorum, and that's a university in Rome. And when he did his dissertation, he wrote on someone who was not at that time a saint, but is now. And that is, of course, John Henry Newman. And he compared and contrasted and developed Newman's thought in relationship to the thought of probably the best-known Thomist today. That's Alistair MacIntyre, who's a revert of sorts, having had a long-time tour with independent Marxist thought, but has since himself become a Thomist, and not just any Thomist. So it's a fascinating area of research. But what we'll be speaking about is really, I think, what John Paul II, another saint, was speaking about when in Familiaris Consortio, apostolic exhortation, he wrote, families should grow in awareness of being protagonists of what is known as family politics, and families should assume responsibility for transforming society. Otherwise, families will be the first victims of the evils that they have done no more than note with indifference. Those are strong words. Peter, can you give us a working definition of this encyclopedia-sounding term, familism, and say a bit about what's called the new familism?
Well, as far as familism, or how I understand it, I mean, there's probably more than one definition. And originally, one sociological definition I personally find compelling is one that would stress that you get better outcomes when there is a stress on putting a priority over on one's family, as opposed to putting a value primarily on the preferences or the whims of the individual. Now, that's a more classic, decades-old definition of familism. I think that more recently, when people might use the term familism, what they might understand is the privileging of the status of the family in society, both in the sense that it is the family that's the fundamental cell or foundational unit of society, and that it's the well-being of families that needs to be prioritized in political and economic thinking. So there's more than one definition, but it's the second one in particular that I'm going with for this reason, because there are societies, traditional quote-unquote societies, in which the individual might be suppressed or even sacrificed to what is perceived to be the preferences or material interests of a large family unit. That's not the kind of familism I'm talking about. Rather, it's this idea represented by such institutions as the World Congress of Families, that the family is a worthwhile institution that needs to be defended and prioritized. So that's the one I'm going with. Now, as far as the phrase new familism, that comes from a great researcher named Barbara Defoe Whitehead, and she used the phrase back in 1991 in an article she wrote. And at the time, what she was referring to was that the family had been under enormous assault in popular culture from the late 1960s, as we know, with the Cultural Revolution back then in the West, and right through much of the 70s. But that through the 1980s, there was a kind of, even as the divorce rate skyrocketed, there was a kind of leveling off or stabilization by the end of the 80s of a recognition that the family, quote-unquote family values were important, and particularly the role of dads or fathers. And we could speak more to that, but I don't know that the word has really stuck, and the phrase has really stuck, because then what we witnessed subsequently was, skyrocketing suicide rates in the 21st century, a further deterioration of the family structure, certainly in the United States. So I don't know that there's been a new familism that's taken hold as a movement. And much of the research on fatherhood has been neglected, especially these last 5 years. It's like no one wants to talk about it. So I don't know that I'm optimistically speaking in the terms that she was 30 years ago. But familism as a program, socially, economically, politically, I do think that's the sticking point. That's what's most important right now.
I see. Mario, what would you ask Peter to help set the stage?
Well, it's very interesting what he said. So if I understood well what you're saying, Peter, we need to start from a view of family which gives priority to families as a cell of society over society. So in society, we have these different orders, economic order, political order, you name it. But if that then is the case, the view that you are proposing here go counter the view that we hold in contemporary society, where we give primacy to the individual. And so then, am I right in my assessment? So in some ways, what you're proposing is countercultural to what we are living today.
And nowhere more than in the United States. I know I'm speaking with long-term philosophy instructors who are my elders, so believe me, I'm not lecturing. I'm speaking to the choir here when we say that we go way back, particularly to Hobbes, whom Orestes Brownson, perhaps the greatest intellectual historian of the 20th century in the United States, and it was a European professor who said that. But he pointed out the impact that Thomas Hobbes has had a long time on what Brownson called the Anglo-Saxon mind. And it's not that the average American is a quote-unquote Hobbesian or follower of Thomas Hobbes, consciously or not, on most things. But what Hobbes did was initiate a long line of what we've been impacted by in the Western world and even globally as what could be called a kind of bachelor philosophy, because he resituated the individual as the primary unit of society, both politically and economically. That it was the preferences of the individual, the appetites of the individual, both consumeristically, and there was an emerging market economy when Hobbes wrote, and he believed in the market economy, but also politically this idea of this atomistic individual who joined society for quote unquote for his own interest, so to speak, his or her own interest, instead of seeing things in terms of, well, individuals are always raised within human families. We're not raised by tarantulas in the wilderness or something, right? We're always raised within families, and people at the time said as much. But even John Locke, who is a huge influence on the American mind, even as he combated Hobbes, on certain things, he still took this idea, he's another bachelor, of the individual as the fundamental unit of society, who joins society, who contracts to join society, when really what we all know is that it's families that join other families, and individuals are raised within those families and communities of families. But the whole story has been, since Hobbes and Locke, and then through Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was exposed to Locke, and then from Kant, who was exposed to both Locke and Rousseau, and then through Nietzsche and so on, that it's the individual that stands, and Emerson, if you will, who's been exposed to Kant and Rousseau and so on, that it's the individual who stands, as it were, supreme. And Americans have always had these countervailing, counterbalancing influences, thank God, that came from sense of civic culture, civic responsibility, classical civic, cultures. There's no one thing that contributed to American thought and culture in this sense, as well as the Christian institutions to which they belonged and the frontier communities to which they belonged, that kind of could correct for that. But with the impact of German professors fleeing Hitler in the 1930s, and Alan Bloom tells this, story so compellingly in his book, The Closing of the American Mind, they brought with them from Germany the emotivism that laid the seeds for both a communist reaction, the Antifaschiste in Germany at the time, funded by the Soviet Union, and the brown shirts, who were, they had nothing else to go on but emotion. And they brought that to the United States. These were the communists, basically, who established the Frankfurt School and established themselves at Columbia University in New York and at Berkeley in California. And within a generation, their language about lifestyle and values and the absolute subjectivization of everything really set us on a path that is essentially Nietzschean. They brought with them Max Weber's version of emotivism and subjectivism, which was not hyper-individualistic, but he was channeling Nietzsche at some level about this idea that all things are subjective, all things are relative. Well, that's the soil out of which fascism grows. And Mussolini said as much. He said, if all values are equal, if there is no right or wrong, then we fascists see no reason why we cannot impose and coerce our program. He's very public about that, and he was a deep reader of Nietzsche. That same thinking has now embedded itself in American culture for, going back, beginning in the 30s, but then really hitting and impacting, obviously, by the 60s. That's where it really blows up, when it's conflated with Marxist themes and so on. So there's this huge emphasis, you're right, Mario, there's this huge emphasis on the individual that's corrosive of the idea that's, prioritizing family.
We've just gotten a whirlwind tour of intellectual life in the United States and its sources, and someone who does a lot of history is Christopher Zender. Do you want to join in this analysis, Christopher?
Well, I'm not sure what I want to join in on. I do have a philosophical question.
All right.
How do you see the family fitting within the larger context of the common good of the broader society? I'm thinking in terms of Thomas and Aristotle both see family as an imperfect society, but as the state as a perfect society, insofar as the state has all those things which are necessary for human life in order to, it is the real purveyor of the common good. What is the relationship of the good of the family to the good of the state, and how do those two things interact?
Well, that's a fantastic question, and obviously, leads to a lot of discussion, because on the one hand, we do have this model of the nuclear family, and some people say, well, the nuclear family was a construct that lasted about 15 years sometime in the mid-20th century, and that really it's the extended family that we should be looking at when we talk about families. That is a model that comes from Northern Europe. It is something that predates the 20th century. It's not something that just invented in the 20th century, this idea of a relatively self-sufficient nuclear family. However, communities, obviously, families associate, if it's not individuals on the whole, for the most part, like Hobbes and Locke said, that join communities and contract with them, it is families. And so, Aristotle points that out, right, that families bound together for their own good. But what's Aristotle's conception of a polis, of a community? Following Plato, you're talking about 4,000 to 5,000 people. That's his idea of a community. And both Aristotle and Aquinas believed in large confederations. Aristotle was a big purveyor of the Alexander the Great's program of a great empire. But that was not the locus of moral community for him, as you know, and nor was it for Aquinas. When Aquinas speaks of patriotism, so to speak, but patria could be, for all one knew, one's province, one's town, within the broader empire, of which Aquinas also believed in. I think that this is a compelling question, because on the one hand, we could say, well, doesn't the community, however we're defining it, as a confederation, as a locality, ask families to sacrifice? We all know people who are in the military, maybe family members, who are called upon to go overseas, and they're away from their children, they're away from their spouses. And they're doing that, however, what are they doing that? What is it that men in the field or women in the field are thinking of when they're over there? They are thinking about serving their country, in broad terms, but really, subjectively, what they're really thinking about is, I'm defending my family. And so these larger communities exist for the sake of families, even as families are called upon to make sacrifices for the common good of collections of families of any scale. I'm not saying that resolves your question. I'm just saying those are the terms in which I've been inclined to think about it.
Yeah, I think it does to some extent. It's because the question has to come down to, does the family exist for the sake of the broader community? Does, in some sense, the broader community exist for the sake of the family? And in a certain sense, it's both, right?
Right.
Because that common good is the good of each of those families, but it's also the common good of all the families together. But it's not like it's an either-or situation where when one can be sacrificed for the other, it would seem.
Right.
There's a harmony.
Right.
There's a harmony. So often it's the case in the thought of the common doctor, St. Thomas, it's so often the case that harmony is the goal, and it's a kind of a creative, constructive, symphonic order that is the ideal. I'd like to go back a little bit to the intellectual history. If we have, on the one hand, something that leads to expressive individualism, and on the other hand, leads to communism, don't we have something that is almost unfathomable? How is it that we have I guess you might say a Hobbes to Nietzsche seedbed that gives rise on the one hand to an expressive individualism and on the other hand to communism? I don't get it.
Yeah, well, I think they both have roots in, as we all know, in nominalism, the prior metaphysical commitments in terms of intellectual history, is this idea
well,
of the emphasis.
One quick thing, Peter. I'm sure most of our gentle listeners, faithful auditors, don't know that it all comes from nominalism. So
okay.
Go slow with us. Go slow.
Okay, so again, with our esteemed questioners, just to they already know what the phrase means, but you're right. For courtesy's sake, it should be explained this way. So basically, whereas we all know, or biologists know, there are natures, there are kinds of things, there are kinds of animals. We learn about that, in biology class and so on. There are classes, there are orders, and so on, and there are fuzzy boundaries sometimes around these things. But we basically know this. There was
You're not talking about platypuses, are you?
Yeah. An evolutionary anomaly for sure, yes, in Australia, the platypus marsupial. Well, basically, there was in the 14th century, especially, something that said, well, it had a duel with this guy named William of Ockham, in particular, at Oxford. So it starts in England. This particular version of this, that he had a dual thing going on, whereby he said, on the one hand, well, we don't know natures, because each thing is so radically different, that even though they appear similar, really they're radically different. And he was saying that each one had their own informing principle. He didn't speak in terms of atoms, the way earlier versions of people had done this. He said, no, but each thing has its own form. So it's not only that we don't know their matter, we don't even know what's holding that individual together. Now, and then the second thing was that our minds aren't really perceiving things as really sharing in certain qualities, is that they're associating things mentally as seeming the same. Now, I know that sounds a little challenging and highbrow and so on, but here's the end result is we can't really say that human beings share a common goal. That's not necessarily his he didn't necessarily want to wind up there. And he did speak of human beings as being subject to what he called natural law. But what does natural law mean at that point? Because until Occam, people like St. Thomas had said, well, we're all subject to a law of human reason, of human nature, and this is supposed to lead to something, which would be the vision of God, perhaps, or in the enjoyment of God in an afterlife as well through grace. And with Occam, though, what does natural law mean? Well, this percolates for 300 years, and by the time of Thomas Hobbes in England, he's at Cambridge, it means, well, the laws of nature mean that we're all subject to selfishness, to ambition, to satisfying our appetites however we can. And then John Locke will push back on that and try to reestablish, say, no, it's a moral natural law we're talking about. But he can't speak either to the idea of what is the ultimate reason for which we're alive. That's what natural law had meant, and it didn't mean it anymore. And that's what we've been stuck with. And then we get to Kant, and Kant will say, well, because I don't know human nature, I can't even talk about a natural law. I have to give a law to myself. We should all pretend as if we give ourselves rules, because we don't know. Our minds are locked inside the four walls of our skull. We cannot figure out our own nature, any other man's. And Nietzsche will run with that. He hates Kant because Kant speaks about things like duty and obligation. Nietzsche doesn't want any of that, but he said, that's fine. I'll make my own laws all day long. And that's what we've been stuck with ever since. We don't know why we're alive. I'm supposed to, quote unquote, give meaning to my own life and existence. I remember here, I'm in New York, and after 9/11, Yankee Stadium was filled with speakers and people praying, and the Cardinal and so on of New York. And Oprah Winfrey is the keynote speaker and coordinator, and she said, we all give meaning to our own lives. Well, that's warmed over Nietzsche. And, that's not, how well has that been serving us is the question. It's not, would that work, and can people really do that, as opposed to discovering what the meaning of our lives really is for everybody. It's rather, has it not been radically failing us for at least 50 years, in the suicide rates we're seeing, in all the kind of, phenomena we're witnessing. So I hope I didn't over-answer that, but I mean, that's my own take on it.
Well, two points, just real quick points, and then I want Mario to tell us if he's following your analysis or if he wants to detract from it or add to it. But my 2 points, 2 cents worth. given this idea that goes all the way back to nominalism, to wit, that we can't know things as they really are, given that and its progression through to Oprah Winfrey, kind of a warmed-over Nietzscheism, which says, since we can't know things as they really are, let's make up our own story as we go along. I still don't see any connection between that and Marxism. Marxism, as a materialist philosophy, gives rise to order of its own sort, discipline, and certainly doesn't give priority to the individual. So how is it that the Marxist fits into this progression?
There is a logic to it, because Marx himself does wind up becoming a nominalist. At first, Marx initially believes that there is a human nature and that man should be a god for man. He's following a guy named Feuerbach, who had been an ex-theology student, who said this and used the whole Christian analogy of love, but said, but it's not God we should be loving. That's alienating our nature. We should be loving each other. Until an egoist, and this is his philosophy, egotism, a German egotist named Mark Stirner, said, well, boy, what pious atheists we have, and how does he know that that's human nature? Feuerbach. And that's when Feuerbach, stung by this, retreated and said, yeah, I guess we just are what we eat. That's where the expression comes from. That's all we amount to.
Feuerbach in his later days said that there'll never be a successful revolution in Ireland until they switch from a diet of potatoes to beans. He actually said that. At any rate, now here, let me get in my second point, because you're telling us that Marxism does, in the person of Marx no less, does ultimately come to give up on a kind of universal human nature. This might seem like it's off of several walls and coming from left field, but you no doubt have noticed that when the going gets tough, a lot of young people will say, when the dialectic going gets tough, a lot of young people will say, whatever.
Right.
Right. Would you say that takes us to even lower level than Oprah Winfrey? Whatever.
Well, yeah. As you know, and which is why you raised the point, is that the delirium of Nietzsche, of the possibilities of rebelling against convention and what everyone else thinks, and people might have that rush when they're 13. I'm trumping the culture. I see past, I see through. Isn't this exciting? I'm going to break all the rules, and then it becomes flat and boring. Because there is no more drama to life. There is no goal to strive for of my nature. There is no battle between good and evil. It's what people always loved about, say, Star Wars or something like that, is the battle between good and evil, or the movies and film, and inspired by the films of Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien. So the thing is that, but it also goes back to your point, is that's the point that the semi-Nietzschean, somewhat Nietzschean Jean-Paul Sartre, the French existentialist, arrived to initially, is by the night he writes a novel called The Nausea. Now he says that I just feel I'm just nauseous with life at this point. I don't feel any of this. He becomes an alcoholic, dies an alcoholic. He runs around all the time, sleeps around, not faithful to his partner, Simone Beauvoir, who then writes a book, bashing men essentially, because she's kind of fed up with that. And but then what a lot of people don't know is 2 months before he dies, he gives an interview in a Marxist publication in which he says, I don't buy this anymore. I believe there's a God. I believe that my life is not a mistake. And he commits this in writing in his diary, and shocks Beauvoir and the Marxist world, though you'll never hear about this in college university philosophy programs. And what's more is that but his initial solution to this nausea and this, this malaise and this whateverism is Marxist commitment. He becomes a Stalinist with Beauvoir. So he says the solution to alienation and the fact that I'm bored is let's join a giant Marxist international army and get organized and hang out together and create a meaning for ourselves by doing something big. And by the time the Cultural Revolution takes place in May of '69 in Paris, that's what he's all excited about. It is forbidden to forbid. But then that blows over and people are bored all over again. And that's what we're living with today, and especially in families where there's a 40% of kids in America are raised without a two-parent family. The sense of confusion, the sense of being unmoored, and the immersion in social media, especially these last 2 decades, have led to this sense of malaise. So if wisdom is the beginning of thinking of one's origins and one's destiny, consciously and out loud, as Aristotle said, once we're immersed in social media and can't think past, 9 seconds without being distracted, I think that's what we're down to. That's how are people going to have wonder sparks in them? How are they going to listen? Well, so again, I hope I'm not over answering that. I think I'm speaking to the choir here, that most people, have already arrived at these conclusions on their own. But I'm just trying to answer your question there, Jim.
Well, I had never heard of Sartre's final position. I'd never heard of that at all, and I'd be interested in tracking that down. But Mario,
you can find it in the book, The Intellectual
join in, please.
Yeah.
So I don't know where to start, but you are touching on an issue that is happening today, which is I think, the contradiction that we are going through in this world with this crisis, with the coronavirus, which is movement, and you see clearly this in Europe, in Spain, in Latin America in general, where movement which have a notion of the state as protector, so to speak, they are quasi-paternalistic, even some of them are totalitarian, they come from the left. Mm-hmm. And so 5 months ago or 10 months ago, they were against international institutions because international institutions were the symbol of imperialism. And also they were rejecting some countries whose hegemony they rejected. Now, with this crisis, they not only support, they are favoring certain international institutions so that they can be protected from this coronavirus. In other words, in order to survive, somehow they are joining, quote-unquote, the enemy. So you have now groups or activists from feminism to left-wing activists who today they trust international institutions. And on the other hand, those who were more individualistic are doing the same. So, in other words, when you are showing that, well, in Marx, you have on the one hand overprotector state, which was going to solve all the contradictions on the one hand, and then a view, very individualistic view of the family. I see that contradiction today unfolding. And so it's very confusing for some governments, some administration to manage the crisis politically. I'm not talking about the health issues here, but politically it's very hard. So, and there has been an even debate among well-known philosophers today. I just mentioned Zizek, the philosopher from Slovenia, which said, well, that we are beginning to the demise of capitalism. But at the same time, he claiming that, while at the same time taking advantage of capitalism and trusting precisely the market in order to sell his own books. So today we are getting into a very confusing time in some ways if we are looking for the logic or the sequence of certain way of thinking. Because it seems that when history run into a crisis, then everything seems to be up for grabs, and the consistency is not there. So I don't know what to think about that, because that is what is happening, and I don't know, what do you think about that? I mean, I'm curious to hear what you have to say about this contradiction of current contradictions.
Well, I'm not familiar with the current political situation in Spain, except to know that the socialists are in charge. I'm somewhat aware of what's been going on in Italy. Latin America, I have not been keeping up on lately, only because I think that, the COVID-19 thing is so dominating a lot of our headlines, and I haven't been able to keep up on the situation there in political terms. But obviously you're raising a question, I think it's on everybody's minds, that, one of the things, I know there's a school of thought that says that these cycles, there are cycles, and it's not that they're deterministic cycles of the kind that, Augustine critiqued in his work Civita Does Days. But there are these socio-political, socio-cultural cycles that last decades, whereby we tend toward a certain kind of internationalism and openness. And then that gives way after a while to more of a nationalism. That people's populations come to the conclusion, look, we have not been well served by an excess of this. And they consolidate, they bite back down on their own identities. But then, given enough time, the obvious need for cooperation emerges again. There was a lot of integration due to the telegraph, and I remember James Billington, the former Librarian of Congress, gave a fascinating talk in which he was a historian of Europe for the most part, and he pointed out how the revolutions of 1848 the stranger's bedfellow. You had Jacobins who were atheists and hated Christianity in the same movement alongside Catholic monarchists who wanted to restore the French monarchy in situations in what were called the revolutions of 1848 across Europe. And what it seemed to have a lot to do with was a doubling down on one's national identity, on ethnic identity, because the telegraph on the one hand and the railroad on the other seemed to threaten that kind of unity. Pope Gregory XVI once said that, no, we can't allow the railroad in the Papal States. It will bring the devil. And the reason for that was that people saw the erosion in the industrial age of identity. And the West has always been a very mobile society in antiquity, and then again beginning, this last millennium, through trade and people moving around a lot, the Mediterranean world, and then into the Western world, into these continents here, the Western Hemisphere. But there are these periods where people feel that way, and then there was a lot of enormous openness in international trade prior to the First World War. People thought that war was dead. War would never ever emerge. Around the year 1900, it would never come again. People were trading all the time. But then people were caught up in patriotic fervor during the First World War. And after the Second World War, and then after the First War, people realized, look, we really got to get together and not make sure this doesn't happen again, and we need international cooperation. We had the League of Nations. And it starts in again. We had World War II. And then there was a real perceived need for international cooperation. We had the World Bank. It had a gold standard. The Bretton Woods Agreement, or rather I should say, and the gold standard and the U.S. dollar, and later we had NATO during the Cold War, and the United Nations, and all these things seem to be very important. But I think the clarion call was called, I think, earliest by one of our two great sociologists. Not that there are only two great sociologists, but there are two men I've both seen referred to as the greatest sociologists in American history. Take it or leave it, true or false. One was Robert Nisbet, and the other at Columbia University, and the other was Dr. Christopher Lask. And Christopher Lask, I think his last book, and he wrote some really good ones, over a 20-year period especially, was called The Revolt of the Elites and the Betrayal of Democracy. Mm-hmm. And in that book in the 90s, he said, the disconnect is between the working class, which often has a clearer sense of what life is all about and what it entails and what it means, and a kind of super class that is international. And he said this is very dangerous because this super class, this knowledge class, as it was being called at the time, it sees itself as global. It sees itself as international. And it has an illusory sense of its own possibilities, and it gets lost in a kind of dream world where it thinks it can create its own reality, because it often does in the external world. And this is not what life's all about, and this will not yield ultimate satisfaction. It seems to provide meaningful work and projects and fun connecting and networking for people, but these people lose their own sense of place and of obligations to other people. In America, once upon a time, we were very connected. The wealthy lived in the wealthy part of town, but they subsidized the things that were going on in their town, and the men might belong to the same civic clubs as men across the spectrum. Unless you were a homeless person, working class, you all belonged to the Elks Club. Everybody knew each other, and there was a sense of mutual support and of local pride in your local community. This comes unhooked, and the mechanics of it were later unpacked with a fantastic 2013 book by the sociologist Charles Murray, who doesn't refer to LAF specifically, but arrives at this by what he calls the college sorting machine. And it starts with Harvard in the 1950s. Once upon a time, the people who go into the Ivy League schools went because you were a legacy. You belonged to a certain moneyed class. You were part of the leadership class. They were going to educate leaders for the future. That's how it worked. You didn't necessarily have the best grades in town, but you could afford to go, and your family got you in. What happens with Harvard is that they then raise their standards academically and say, that's what we're shooting for. If you're smart, we're going to be egalitarian about this. You get in because now people still get in because they're rich or because of who their family is. But we're really going for academic standards. And by 1958, they basically reached their goal, and all the other IBs started imitating them, and then other schools started imitating them. Well, what happens then is that people are siphoned off from communities around the country. And whereas once upon a time, smart might have married average intelligence, the smartest people in the country are now marrying each other. And with the passing of the industrial mechanized economy to the knowledge economy, smarts equals money. And
right.
Smarts equals money equals I'm going to live where I want to, and we all live together. And what that means is we're reduced to a certain number of zip codes on both coasts, on the West Coast and on the East Coast and maybe South, Western Florida or something. And we live there. And when you have multiple generations of this, of kids then who are born into gated communities, and grandkids then of those kids who are born into gated communities. And they're all having a lot of fun, but the rest of the country, the United States, is flyover country. And they love to, engage in international travel. They have no idea what the average person goes through. And that's not just true in the United States. That would be true globally, right? Global elites are interconnected. There was a book by a guy named, I think his name was Rothke, called Superclass. He used to work for Henry Kissinger, and he wrote about this and about the Davos meetings, which are limited to something like 2,000 people in Switzerland every year. And he said this class is more concerned as a peer group internationally with what other people in that class think of them than anything that they think about the person who lives a few miles from them or in the same city. Their interests their ideology is globalist. It's not local. And it's not that they're quote unquote bad people. Murray even points out, I'm not going to, shout hurrah for everything Charles Murray's ever written. I couldn't do that. I haven't read everything Charles Murray's ever written. I'm speaking specifically about this premise though, because he claims to see it and he documents this. But their thinking is very much, first of all, they consider themselves cosmopolitan and diverse, but any kind of group settles into an ideological conformity due to group dynamics and mutual interest, whether it's conscious or not. So whether it is an elite in Colombia that attends Western universities, or from Paraguay, they've all gone. The leader class is always they're all going to Harvard or Yale or Princeton or Oxbridge or what have you.
Exactly.
Right. So Mario, make any sense, or what do you think?
Well, you are describing something is happening, and just a couple of examples. When you see the quote-unquote elite of Latin America people in Buenos Aires, in Paraguay, in Brazil, the children of the elite, I'm talking about people who work in government, people who are members of the official political party, people from the who own big industries. So the first thing that they do after graduating high school is they send their children to study here, and they go to the best universities, Stanford, Harvard, and Yale, and all that. And so they went back and they formed an elite, and they are communicating with people from here, and they held conferences, and when they discuss poverty, they discuss development, and so they are part of a club, and they married among themselves. So there is an elite which is running the show and telling us what to do. And I know by first experience that because I was part of one of those groups until I just decided that that was not my call. But again, that is happening, and you have, when you just read some posts today from some politician in Spain, and they are claiming that the solution for X, Y, or Z policy regarding the coronavirus is what is coming from a researcher in Harvard. So there is a huge net of communication among these elites. And then on the other hand, you have people who are what we call the working class, the peasantry, if you will, who are not even know about the existence of this world, and that leads to another point when you examine here, even when I live, where are the zip codes where most people are getting the coronavirus are precisely those places in the city which are the poorest one and who are the disadvantaged one because they may not even have cable in order to know what are the policies they need to be aware in order not to get contagious. So, and I think these two layers, if you will, in a broader sense, of classes is what is forming. And then you have, on the one hand, this philosopher gathering through Zoom and discussing about the march of capitalism, and all of them come from elite universities.
Exactly.
So,
can I jump in here to try to pull together 43 threads? And I can do it by way of, as an old teacher of mine used to say, by way of easy and natural transition. Christopher Lash's name came up. Peter, you referred to him. And in his last years, he died tragically early. Christopher Lash was a frequent contributor to the New Oxford Review, a publication.
That's right, I remember that.
Yes, that I've been associated with for, at least 40 years. Now, Lash says, among many, many other things, and this takes us back to the family, and this can be our way of uniting the 47 threads. Lash says that, quote, to see the modern world from the point of view of a parent is to see it in the worst possible light. Now, we have our own Christopher Sender, and I want to ask Christopher, in Ohio, in towns that have around 400 people in them, and as a parent in such a town, does the modern world look pretty menacing to you?
Well, coming from California originally, too, yes, and having lived in Connecticut, it's always looked rather menacing to me. And I think it's menacing in a number of different ways. I mean, we talk about the elites and the power of the government. That's sometimes a very menacing thing because we really don't have much control of that at all. It's also menacing, I think, in terms of the struggles that people have economically, and especially if you're a faithful Catholic and you want to have a large family, the fears that arise because of the seeming machine-like quality of the economy is something which I think is probably one of the areas where the modern world seems most threatening to families. I mean, it's something that actually affects them on the everyday level, and we see this now, of course, with the coronavirus and so many people out of work. And so I think that's one of the things when I think of this whole question of the family, oftentimes, especially in conservative circles, I think what we have in mind is a family of a certain economic class, fairly comfortable, where the father can work and support the wife at home and that type of thing. But I don't think that addresses, and has addressed for a long time, a lot of the struggles that actual families have. The people who are poor, the lower middle class, the working class, just for the material support, and that would be. I think Dr. Mango can comment on this perhaps, is that when we look at the things like economic life, that's the material foundation of the family. You remove that, you remove the stability of the family. So I think that's one of the areas where if we're going to address this question of the family, we have to really address those questions of economic need and stability.
We also, not that Christians shouldn't engage in economics, they surely should, but we also have some distinctively Christian insights into the life of the family, and we have distinctively Christian insights into the strengths of character, way of referring to virtues, the strengths of character that make family life possible, make it sustainable. And sometimes when we look to these virtues, we come across terms that seem very much at odds with contemporary life and quaint even to contemporary life. There's the virtue of filial piety. Filial piety, and it's intriguing. In Thomas Aquinas' discussion of filial piety, although he discusses it at more than one point, that his discussion of it is key to this notion of connaturality, sharing in the same nature as. So children manifestly share in the nature of their parents. But then filial piety is joined with, in Thomas's discussion, patriotism, authentic patriotism, the authentic love of one's people, as in one's country. And there's a connaturality there, because without a stable political order, our lives couldn't be sustained at all. And then, of course, there's piety that maybe is the first kind of piety that comes to our mind, the pious religious person. And we have that kind of piety because, well, God is our Father. God is our Father. And life with God is our true homeland, and God gives us the very nature that we have. So in classical Thomistic thought, questions of the character of the state are certainly addressed, but in terms of the character of the nation and the role of the family, well, that's part of a discussion of piety, and all of this is conjoined with the piety of the religious believer. But I don't think these themes are grouped together at all in contemporary discussions. And it seems to me that we should surely, as Christian intellectuals, retrieve the virtue of filial piety. And it's especially intriguing in a period in which we're hoping to have some kind of intelligible, coherent, constructive conversation with China, because filial piety is central to Confucius in the thought that stems from Confucius. So there's so much to be said in contextualizing the family. We have the movement of familism, and we have familism very much at odds with expressive individualism, and we have the family that has to be seen in the context of income. And certainly in the context of whether or not you are a parent, because if you are a parent, you think about family in a way that is immediate and pressing and inescapable. But, as is so often the case, we have the countervailing cultural forces of film and television and the historical forces of the Nietzschean dissolution and Marxist pseudo-solidarity, and all of that, of course, now has a special twist because we have the ascendancy of LGBT thinking, in which the family is either torn apart or revised in such a way that it's no longer what it really is. And as always, when we come to the end of these discussions, we have 87 different ways that we would do well to continue them. But we only have a few minutes left, so I want to ask Mario first, and then Christopher, and then last words for Peter, and then we'll have to close. Mario, final thoughts?
Well, my final thought is it's a very interesting, really. Thank you, Peter, for your insight. But my question is very practical. What do we need to do in order to restore this sense of the family that we are talking about here, in order to counter this wave of new thinking, or not new thinking, but this secularism which is rampant in our society, I think globally?
What to do? What to do?
Yeah.
All right. That's
what
your
would be
question. Now, Christopher.
Well, I mean, I don't know what to say exactly, except that I think that this is really the key. I think if we're going to actually reform society, we have to take the family very seriously. Once again, we have to see it as the basic unit of society, and we have to order the forces of society to whatever way we can towards the good of the family, and that would be on all different levels. But that has to be the primary consideration in the social order is the family and restoring the family. I'm not sure exactly how one does that, especially when it's suffered like it has, but perhaps one of the ways.
Well, our fledgling American Solidarity Party is very keyed in on the importance of the family and how it has to be a central consideration rather than a peripheral one. Peter, your last thoughts for us, please.
Well, just that I think it comes down to one word, is repent. I mean, the thing is that we can swim in data, psychological, social, economic, and nothing will ever change. And sometimes we might be waiting for, those people to change, whoever those people happen to be, whether it's, ecclesiastical or political, that social class, whatever. But each of us is called to do something perhaps different wherever we are. And the best thing we could probably do is to band together as families to be the best possible families we can be, reliant on a higher power. That's the main thing. That's central. Sometimes I'm tempted to move to Central America, but my wife says, no, we're not going to do that today. So, and that's just a holding pattern anyway, because it's a matter of time before a globalist agenda, thoroughly kicks in everywhere, possibly, perhaps, hopefully not. So I think it's a matter of grace more than it is of anything.
Repent? Holy mackerel, that is radical. Well, we end with the gospel for today's liturgy, and it's the gospel of John. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, so that everyone who believes in him might not perish, but might have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world might be saved through him. Whoever believes in him will not be condemned, but whoever does not believe has already been condemned, because he has not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. And this is the verdict, that the light came into the world, but people preferred darkness to light because their works were evil. For everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come toward the light, so that his works might not be exposed. But whoever lives the truth comes to the light, so that his works may be clearly seen as done in God. The Gospel of the Lord. Come, Lord Jesus, come.
Hi there, this is Christine Mooney Flynn, host of the Catholic Mama podcast, and I'd like to invite you to join me over on the Catholic Mama. To develop a Christian family and raise children who are, and who, God willing, will continue to be confident Catholics, requires us as parents to be confident in our faith as well. So each week, I dive into topics that help to make sense of the Catholic faith and how to live out that faith in our vocation as husbands and wives, moms and dads. So whether you need help in explaining aspects of Catholic doctrine like the real presence in the Eucharist, or if you're looking for practical ideas on how to live a more Catholic life, my goal is that you'll find the answers and guidance you're looking for over on my show, The Catholic Mama. I hope to see you there.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.